Late summer is the perfect time to evaluate your crop for next season's fertility needs. On this episode of FieldLink, Helena Agronomist Shane Powers joins us from Mississippi to discuss strategies for planning your fertility plan for 2026. Plus, Shane will share some insight on nematodes and how now is the perfect time to evaluate your farm for this yield-robbing pest. Finally, Jody Lawrence joins us from Nashville to provide some insight on the upcoming Pro Farmer Tour across the Midwest and how those yield estimates may impact the commodity markets. Stay tuned for this episode of FieldLink. This episode is brought to you by the Future Plots from Helena. Ask your Helena representative how this information from the Helena Future Plots can guide you through your seed planning journey for next season. Welcome to FieldLink. I'm your host, Bill Smith. On this episode, we're going to introduce Shane Powers. Shane is an Agri-Intelligence agronomist for Helena. Shane, welcome to FieldLink.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you for having me.
Hey, Shane, before we deep dive into peeling the onion back on some of the content we're going to talk about today, tell our audience a little bit about you. Where's home?
Home is Cleveland, Mississippi, Bill. Born and raised Mississippi Delta and currently reside in Cleveland.
Awesome. So you grew up in Mississippi. Did you go to school in Mississippi?
I actually did. College, Delta State University, right there in Cleveland, Mississippi. I did not go far upon graduation.
Love it. Love it. Cleveland's an awesome town. I had the opportunity to spend some time there here recently. It's a great Delta community.
If you're going to pick one, it's the one to pick, in my opinion.
It certainly is. That's for sure. Okay, so tell us a little bit more about you. You grew up in Mississippi, and you've been with Helena how long?
This is my 13th season with Helena. Started back in, January of 13.
January 13. So have you been an agri-intelligence agronomist the entire time?
So I've been an agri-intelligence agronomist for the past 5. Previous to that, I was an agri-intelligence precision information specialist. I would call those agri-intelligence product managers today.
Yeah, and for our listeners that aren't familiar with agri-intelligence, tell us a little bit about agri-intelligence.
So agri-intelligence is the precision ag side of Helena. It's where most of our data resides when it comes to on-farm data for our growers, soil sampling, tissue sampling, yield data, all the things that help us drive a decision on an acre. I had my hands in that for the first 7 years of my career, and then rolled into the agronomy side where I just added to that staple in 2020.
Wow, 13 crops with Helena. That's awesome. Well, Shane, there's been a lot of, let's kind of have a recap here. We're recording this here in mid-August, this podcast, and there's been a lot of challenges across the Delta this year. Early, we had a tremendous amount of moisture rain. The crop was up and down when we could get in and out. Let's do a little recap about the crop to this point.
Yeah, Bill, it depends on where you're standing. We have areas where we have really good crops coming out and growing off. We have other areas where we failed to get a crop in, depending on the weather we ran into early and in planting season. So we have some prevented plant acres. We have some pretty high yield acres coming out, and we have everything in between. So it really just depends on where you're standing as to what we're dealing with. 25, all those acres for everybody. I mean, we don't have to relive it, but it's been a struggle.
Sure.
We've got a lot of things in the market and in the air that's kind of working against ag right now, but we're making it through, and I feel like our growers are making it through for the most part, the best we can. That being said, 25 is quickly kind of getting turned to the rearview mirror, and we're headed into harvest, and we have 26 ahead of us.
Yeah.
So really trying to plan on how to make 26 better. And the only way we're going to do that is to kind of start getting ahead of it, today and now, and try to make sure that we set ourselves up and our growers up to win in 26.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. 26, the success for 26 really does begin now here as we're entering into the end of summer and fall of 25. But that planning really does start now, doesn't it, Shane?
It does. It does. Most people this time of year, crops start coming off, or the gears start to switch to, fertility planning for what we're going to do next.
Right.
The best way in my opinion, best way to start that plan is through a sound fertility, soil sampling program, so that we get a gauge on where we stand today, what's in the soil today, and then we can identify what that needs to look like moving forward. I kind of mentioned the economy earlier, the farm economy. It's never been more important for our growers and for us to help our growers put their resources in the right spot. And the best way, in my opinion, for us to do that is to identify where we need put that money, where it's going to give them the best return. Now, obviously, we pull soil tests. We pull a lot of soil tests. We make a lot of fertilizer recommendations. Fertilizer, not the cheapest thing in the world right now. So there are times we're going to have to reduce those rates and tweak those applications. And with the right amount of information, we can make really, really sure we're doing that wisely enough to ensure we're going to yield as good as possible coming out of 26.
Yeah.
So we can make the right cuts, right additions there.
And as a part of an agronomist with the agri-intelligence team, you're exposed to a lot of tools, a lot of information, a lot of data that can actually help that producer make that the most efficient decision he or she can for their crop.
Absolutely. As an agri-intelligence agronomist, that's where I live and breathe, and my counterparts live and breathe. We take the tools that we have, whether it be soil samples or yield data or the reports we're able to run when we combine those things, tissue sample information that we pulled from the previous growing season, and combine things like that into information sets to help us learn and to help us make better recommendations on the acre. My previous life here at Helena, well, I said I've been here for 13 seasons. I was actually dedicated to our agri-intelligence side for 7 of those before moving into the agronomy role. So I'm pretty well versed on both sides of that coin. And I do think that the tools that we have here are some of the best in the business to help growers make sure we're making the right investment with their dollar. For sure.
And having that experience is extremely valuable. And speaking of that, we talked a lot about agri-intelligence and agri-intelligence tools. That's really our precision and data platform. We've been involved in this space at Helena for 25 plus years, one of the industry leaders there. Shane, what are some tools specifically that you used or planning on using, I guess, for this fall for some of your producers? And more importantly, what is the data and the information telling you about, I guess, some of the ground that you're going to be working with in your geography this year?
So there's several different tools and data sets that we can look at. From the agri-intelligence standpoint, kind of a more non-conventional thought going in season, we pull a lot of tissue samples. We call that extractor tissue sampling here at Helena. Mm-hmm. We use those in season to help drive decisions. I like to have those in my back pocket as we move into the fall as well, to use those for planning for 26. A lot of people don't think about that very much, but hey, man, if our crops ran short on something this year and we caught it in season, we're able to fix it. We can be more proactive going into the following season and address it ahead of time, maybe to cut off some of that, I guess, potential for loss. But I wouldn't use that standalone. Our soil sampling program is called High Ground. That is here in the Southern Business Unit. We do a lot of zone-based soil sampling. That's where we use soil texture to drive where our samples are pulled. We'll pull those samples, evaluate what those soil tests say, and that'll give us an idea of nutrient levels in the soil that our crops are going to be able to have access to. That will let us know if we're running low on a certain nutrient, if we're in excess of a certain nutrient that could cause an antagonism. It also lets us know, I will say, maybe soil types, conditions when it comes to stuff like cation exchange capacity. We're looking at heavy soils versus light soils because we know we need to manage those differently. If I haven't mentioned pH, obviously it's going to give us a look at pHs in the soil as well to let us know if we need lime or if we need to figure out ways to better manage around a high pH situation. So you take those two pieces of the puzzle, and now we're heading into fall, and we are obviously doing a lot of harvest. So we like to look at yield data as well. Our yield analysis tool here at Helena is True Yield. That's where we pull yield data into the system. We can pair that with the soil information that we're able to gather through soil sampling, and we can start to look at correlations between nutrient levels and yield coming off of your farm so that we can see, all right, where we had more of a nutrient in the soil, did we have a yield that was responding to that? Or if we had a lower yield, was there a yield drag associated with that lower yielding or lower nutrient level in that field? It gives us a really good tool to kind of understand more of the why behind what's going on from a yield standpoint, be it high yield or low yield. You move beyond that, we also pull water samples for spray water as well as irrigation. We do those in season typically or just ahead of season. Again, you can look at those samples and see what pH of water is, how many carbonates or bicarbonates are in that water, so that we can make sure we're putting the right water conditioner in with the spray application so that we get as much efficacy as possible out of that application. It reduces the potential for a need for a respray because something got inactivated through an antagonism in that spray solution. On the irrigation side of that, though, if we see the elevated levels of things in that water that could potentially harm soil structure, it plays into the fertility conversation and what we need to do to address that moving forward for 26 and into next season. Lots of different things that we can look at as long as we have information in that system and as long as we have that open dialogue with our growers so that we can help walk them through what we're seeing and potential solutions that are out there to help work around any perceived threats to something that could hold us back from top yield or at least greatest possible yield.
When you layer all of that information together, it truly does empower you to, I guess, make more strategic decisions to make better investments in terms of creating a fertility plan that fits your cropping needs. Is that right?
To me, Bill, it does. I've been doing this for a long time and make a lot of recommendations every year. And to be able to witness, all right, here's what a soil sample is telling me. Here's what the yield data set is telling me. And here's what these look like together. It allows me to make a recommendation for an application with a lot more confidence, knowing, A, what happened last year, but B, from an even deeper agronomic understanding, all right, this is why that happened. If Helena's got nothing, we have a I won't say an endless, but we have a very deep set of folks who understand those things very well and can look at that information with us to say, oh yeah, you had an imbalance in these two nutrients. Your yield fell off there. That's why we need to make a certain nutrient recommendation. And I can make that recommendation with a lot more confidence if I have access to that information. And I believe our growers, when they can see that, they can have more confidence in what they're spending their resources on as well. So
I would imagine, Shane, with all of this powerful information at your fingertips, you're able to sit down with producers as long with our sales force to really create some customized plans that really lean heavily into our fertilizer efficiency types of programs that can really maximize their investment. Maybe adding a little of this and reducing a little of that. It really creates a lot of powerful insight.
It does. It allows you to create, you go beyond just an application, you start to be able to build a program. And when I talk about the resources available at Helena to our growers, I am talking primarily about those guys at that local level. They're local contacts that they can deal with. They're very well versed in this stuff. Mm-hmm. And to your point, if we're going to make a fertilizer application and we know that we're going to put hard-earned money into this, we want to maximize what we get out of that. And a lot of those soil samples that we pull through our high ground program, reveal to us and to those guys at that local level things that could reduce the efficiency of that fertilizer we put out. So maybe instead of we put out 100 pounds of potash, which is 0060, instead of getting 100% of that, we're only getting half of that. Well, if we make the right addition to that application, to your point, something to help keep that more available, we're going to let that grower's dollar go farther by making more of that nutrient available to the plant. And we can identify through the information that we have where that's more or less likely to happen.
So Shane, you've just wrapped up. Harvest is starting in certain parts of your southern territory. So you've captured all of these extractor tissue samples throughout this past year. What are some general deficiencies that you picked up across your geography this year that growers ought to be aware of?
Yeah, my geography, you mentioned earlier with the weather that we have dealt with, we stayed extremely wet for a long time. We did catch a lot of nitrogen deficiency and have caught a lot of nitrogen deficiency along the way through 25. Again, that's mostly attributed to the conditions that we were dealt. When you stay wet from April through first part of June, that's what happened. So I would say nitrogen showed up a lot. We tried to manage those applications as best we could, but it was an uphill battle for a lot of that. Again, being so wet, our plants didn't get a good root system down in a lot of areas. When that happens, you can run short of a lot of other nutrients, because we went from being really wet with a shorter kind of reduced root system on this crop to being extremely dry almost overnight. So that being the case, we started seeing nutrient deficiencies in several different nutrients. And, depending on where you were standing, you could probably have a laundry list of things. But in a situation like that, something like potassium, a nutrient that plants need in large quantities, need the roots out there to get it, need some moisture. Again, when we went from being too wet, we went to being too dry. So potassium showed up more, I think, from a lack of the root system than lack of application. Micronutrients have shown up quite a bit. Manganese is one that keeps popping its head up almost everywhere I go, on rice, beans, and corn. Haven't seen just a whole bunch of it in cotton, but it happens there as well.
Sure.
Again, soil tests can tell us a lot. Some of this we're able to head off at the pass ahead of season with soil applications, but we can pivot during the year with these tissue samples, with these extractor samples, and make applications to get us through. Micronutrients in particular, the plants don't need super large quantities of them, so putting them on timely can often be an even a preferred way to soil applied. So if we catch micronutrients in extractor tissue sampling,
Sure.
really corrective there.
I think that's what's kind of neat about the Helena Agri-Intelligence system is we're layering this data. In your case that you just laid out there, you've identified some things that this crop is likely short. So the predictability of it being short next year is probably pretty high. And when you pull those soil samples, I'm guessing you can really line those up to make some amendments as needed.
That is the plan. Yes, sir. That's the goal. And I mentioned it earlier, but having that open dialogue with our customers as to what we're seeing and how we feel it's going to impact what's coming, that's the biggest thing. Let's take some time in the fall and really sit down together across from the table with your local Helena rep and your local Helena Agri-Intelligence representative and look through the things that we've collected on that farm across the course of the season. And let's make a plan to move forward, because without a great plan, we're probably planning to fail. So it starts today, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be important this year. It's no secret, as you mentioned, Shane, there's going to be some strain on dollars and resources and, investments, and making wise investments. Let's use the power of all this knowledge that you've collected along with your agri-intelligence team to build the best plan that fits that farm, that field, and that acre for 26.
Yeah, Bill, and I will say that we've talked a lot about nutrition and soil fertility. There's other things out there that we look at a lot.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about disease pressure, insect pressure. One of the main pests that we've been encountering in the Mid-South, in my opinion, it feels like it grows more every year, is nematodes.
Mm-hmm.
And if a grower is really planning on 26, and he's in an area where nematode pressure may be all around him and he hasn't tested for nematodes on that acre, I would highly encourage him to reach out to his Helena rep and at least have a conversation about getting those nematode samples. Because once we get in season, our options are limited on what we can do there. But if we have a plan going into 26, we can make the right moves and make the right applications to outrun those nematodes or just to beat them in 26. So
Mm-hmm.
My one thing outside of the fertility for the fall, highly suggests getting a gauge on where you're at nematode wise.
I think that's a great point. A lot of producers are probably overlooking is that area. I think a lot of them are going to be pointed towards fertility plans and management, which we're certainly talking about and is absolutely critical. But this nematode area, let's dig into that a little bit more. What are some plans? Let's talk about testing for some of those growers that may not have even considered testing. Talk to us about that.
Yes, so nematode testing, ideally, time of year wise, you want to be right there around the end of crop, going into early fall. So either crop's still standing, fixing to come out, or having just harvested. So that puts us in a really good window to get those samples, to get accurate numbers on what might be out there. That being said, once we identify If we have an issue and identify the issue, we can start looking from the seed side on varieties that may or may not be resistant to those nematodes that are present. It opens up the conversation on seed treatments. We need to run a nematicide type seed treatment to try to get that plant up and going and outrun those nematodes. And then just from a standpoint of a nematicide application, are those nematodes at a level at which we need to do that? And if that's the case, a lot of times that's going to happen at planting. So knowing that going into planting season in the spring is going to be a big deal. And those numbers need to be gathered and understood now.
I think that's great advice for producers that fall into that area where nematodes are an issue because, as you mentioned, Shane, I mean, really understanding what you have, understanding what you're going to be dealing with, there's a pretty good handle on what crop's going to go into that field next year. And it ties right into our seed strategy of best understanding what germplasm genetics package is going to fit on that farm. And now's the time to be really having those seed conversations too, in order that we can ensure that we're putting the right germplasm on that acre to, in this case, fight nematodes, keep them, suppressed as best as possible, and then building that, additional plan around it.
Could not agree more.
So, Shane, talk to us a little bit about the nematode pressure in your area. And again, some of our listeners aren't all that familiar with nematodes. Where's your most significant pressure geographically today?
I don't know if you can pinpoint it to one spot. So I mentioned in the intro that I cover our geography up and down the Mississippi River on east and west side. So basically the Mississippi alluvial plain there. From the Boot Hill of Missouri down to South Louisiana, we will run into nematodes.
Okay.
They are typically more prevalent in our lighter, sandier soils, but you get something like a reniform and you can have him showing up out there in some heavy mixed type soil, so a little heavier soil. But generally, our lighter ground is where we're going to see it kind of show up the worst. Different nematodes, different type nematodes affect crops differently. So, depending on the crop we're going to try to grow there, do a little homework and see, all right, if we have some present, which crop will they impact? Which crop will they not impact? Do we need to rotate that acre to a non-host crop next year to get rid of a certain strain of nematode? Or do we rock on the way we've been rocking? But we can't know that unless we're pulling the samples and getting a look at what's there.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice for those growers that are in those areas to really drill down with their Helena rep and agri-intelligence team to really identify what's going on under that soil this time of year so that we can make, again, another piece to the puzzle to the overall strategy for 26. Shane, are there any other pieces of advice that growers ought to consider as they get ready, really going into this harvest time, but really keeping their eye on 26 from a fertility and I guess an overall cropping system standpoint?
Failure to plan is going to be planning to fail. So I would just encourage everybody, let's get as much information as we can together about what we're sitting on that acre from a fertility standpoint, from a pest standpoint, from a what happened this season standpoint, so that we can make the right adjustments as we move into 26. Because last time I checked, cotton's not bringing very much, neither are soybeans. Nothing looks really good right now, but 26, we're going to keep our fingers crossed it's going to get better. And the better we're set up in this type of economy, the better it's going to be when it turns around. So let's plan to win.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, Shane Powers. Agronomically, let's plan to win, and it all starts this fall, even before harvest in many cases, but shortly, thereafter for 26 crop. Shane Powers, Agri-Intelligence Agronomist, want to thank you for joining us on this episode of FieldLink. And welcome back to FieldLink. And joining us from Nashville is Jody Lawrence. Jody, welcome back to FieldLink.
Thank you, Bill. Good to be back. We've had a lot happen since we talked last, and we are kind of getting into the home stretch of crop and potential and how the finishing weather is really going to make or break kind of these record yields.
Boy, I'll tell you, as we've said on this podcast here over the last several times, the crop looks really good. We've had a strong heat blast here the last few days. I know it was well into the 3 digits here in Memphis, and I know up north over the week. And boy, there were touching 100 degrees in a lot of spots throughout Des Moines, Omaha, throughout that Corn Belt region.
Yeah, we were in Chicago over the weekend, did a couple field days on the way up there, and I looked at my phone and it was hotter in Chicago than it was in Nashville, Memphis, or a lot of places in the South. And that never happens. And I talked to all of our guys in Northern Indiana and Northern Illinois, and they had some pop-up stuff, but the people that got the rain, Saturday night were very appreciative of it, because that's really the only spot that those northern areas of Illinois and Indiana that were a little bit behind on moisture. So that was really helpful for them.
Wow. Okay, Jody, we had some big reports come out of the USDA last week that really kind of raised some eyebrows in a lot of cases and, raised some questions. So how about a recap, Jody?
Yeah, the biggest thing, two really big things, is that no one was overly shocked by the yield increase to 188.8, and that's a spectacular number. If you just take it aside, don't look at price impact or anything else, which I know is impossible to do, that 188.8 just shows you the potential of everything that's going on in agriculture when Mother Nature decides to be a friend to all the farmers. The estimate was 184.4, so it was certainly over trend line at 182. But with the crop conditions where they have maintained through the summer, and especially you look at Iowa and their corn crop rate had been in the 80s all year, it's really impressive. The thing that really threw the market for a loop was they're basically in harvested acres. USDA told us there was a 2 million acre switch during planting that went from beans to corn. And it wasn't the extra yield that really put a negative jolt through the corn market. It was the extra yield, because the math on adding acres is always far more bearish than it is on just adding a couple bushels. Because think about it this way, 2 million extra bushels, if we do end up with a 188 crop, that's almost 400 million extra bushels, where if you add 5 bushels to a 90 bushel crop, it's 450 million. So it's really the acres that really the straw that probably is going to break the camel's back this year in the corn market. And the kind of the inverse on beans, the yield went up 53.6, which if realized will be a new record. But when you take 2 million acres from beans, all of a sudden that took off 100 million bushels, and we've gotten, the better part of a 60-cent rally, a lot of it due to the report. So we've got two markets kind of going different directions, and it's really because the acreage switch, and everybody knew and everybody saw it coming and were prepared at, $3.90 December corn futures and $10 November beans. But then the acreage switch, now we're sitting at about that number on corn. It's rallied a little bit just on some profit taking, but the bean number is the one that we have to look at, that right now maybe is a really good time to catch up on some sales, because you just can't walk away from a 60-cent rally as bearish as we have been all summer.
Yeah, now might be a great opportunity to do some forward thinking here as far as those bean opportunities. Okay, Jody, that increase in corn, did it all just come from beans? I mean, surely some other crops had to take a hit.
Well, when you look at the map and what the USDA told us, it all came from the Western Corn Belt. Okay. The Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, 80% of it, if not more. And then you kind of get into a little bit of Minnesota with the increases. It didn't come from the Eastern Belt. And the reason why that was, they started getting those spring rains and those planting rains, which were the best that they'd had in a decade or more, probably all the way back to 2016. Right. And they decided, hey, the conditions are good, and this may be our chance to, plant a little more corn. And that's where a majority of it came from, was the Northern Plains and the Western Corn Belt.
Wow. Wow. Okay. All right. So, hey, we've got a big week ahead of us. The crop tour is starting across the Corn Belt. This is with Farm Journal. They're going to start out in the east as far as Ohio and Indiana. One group of crop consultants will be making their way west to Rochester, Minnesota, for a final stop there, as well as another group starting out in the western part in South Dakota, Nebraska, doing a tour throughout that area, working their way east to all meet up in Rochester on this Thursday in Rochester for our final report. And it'll be interesting to see what the yield estimate, the final estimate, brings to us and how that will impact the market.
Yeah, I think when you look at, there have been several tours that, the numbers are comparable so far, smaller private tours. I know Ag Resource has been out there and some other companies that don't promote it as much as Pro Farmer does. But we have no reason to believe that they're going to get in there and substantially refute the USDA's number. They'll validate it, and whether it comes in at 187 or 189, it's like I said, trimming 1 bushel an acre, might be worth, 10, 15 cents for the market. But it's really the bigger picture of this. If the heat that's going on this week ends as forecast and we have some cooler nights to finish, and that we'll see where we are Labor Day the next time we get together on this. But the biggest complaint that I'm hearing from agronomists or farmers is there's definitely some tip back, and whether that was because of too much rain or the hot nights and then the tight the tight ears during pollination. This number may be a little ambitious, but we certainly don't think, even when all of this is said and done and we get to the January report, that the number is going to drop substantially. But I'll be shocked if it gets below 187 unless a couple derecho events happen between now and then.
Sure. Yeah. Well, definitely looking forward to the crop tour, getting the numbers. I'll be on site with our seed team as we introduce our future plot strategy at one of the Yield Academy sessions in conjunction with crop tour. So we're looking forward to being with that group and learning what these final yields are. And gosh, Jody, how they could potentially impact some profitability opportunities for growers.
Absolutely. Because this, looking at what you're going to be a part of, the new seed and the new, just the new plans on how to boost those yields per acre. And this is what our industry is about. We have to keep moving forward. We can't come together as an industry and go, oh, the price is bad, because we've been through this before. It's a cyclical environment driven almost entirely by the weather, and keep moving forward because we've got a big world to feed.
We sure do. Jody, want to thank you for joining us here on FieldLink as we sit back and get ready for the Yield Academy and the crop tour and see where those numbers land this week and how it may impact growers' opportunities. Thanks again for joining us, Jody.
All right. Thank you, Bill, and safe travels for all the Pro Farmer Tour guys and girls.
Thanks, Jody. Thanks for joining us on this episode of FieldLink. Be sure to ask your Helena representative on how this information from the Helena Future Plots can guide you through your seed planting journey next season.